Welcome to Heresy, the Horus Heresy talk show. In this video, we're going to be talking about how to be not competitive while still making effective armies to use on the tabletop in your games of Horus Heresy, the Age of Darkness. In this video, we're going to be talking about what makes a competitive army so that you understand what not to do, how to avoid common competitive patterns, and also some specific things not to do that do tend to result in your armies being a little too competitive. But before we do that, if you enjoy the show, please do leave me a like and subscribe. It really means a lot and helps the channel. And if you've got any feedback or if there's anything you'd like to discuss about the video, then please leave me a comment down below. And with that, on with the show. So firstly, it's important to say that there's nothing wrong with competitive play between, people who want to play competitive games. This video is about trying to police yourself, not other people. If you choose to make an army and you want to make sure that your army is the right level to play against, a whole variety of different other people and to give other people good games, this really is about recognizing maybe the patterns for competitive play so you can make sure you don't apply them to your army. Because we all like making good armies and cool armies, but sometimes you can go a bit too far and sometimes you can do that on accident as well. So this is definitely not about gatekeeping the way other people choose to play if they choose to play games competitively. So why this video? What's the why about it? So, I'm a competitive player. I'm also a narrative player and I play everything in between. I've played, games very competitively for a long time. Most recently, I played Age of Sigmar very competitively. I did a competitive podcast for Age of Sigmar. That's the kind of stuff I do. But I also like, Heresy. And if you've watched a lot of my videos, you'll also know that I'm into the side of the game where, we try to make sure both players enjoy it rather than just trying to crush someone, which is, also absolutely okay. Just not, what we're about in this case. Trying to self-police in this way is actually quite a challenge. It's quite fun. What I find is it's really interesting to try and put an army together that ticks all my boxes for what I want the army to do, but also gives my opponent interesting things to deal with as well, rather than only thinking about how I want to win. And I recognise plenty of other people trying to do the same as well, particularly from the comments on a lot of my videos. There's lots of people who have maybe come to the game from 40k or come from another competitive game who are trying to get that balance right. And, by understanding how the competitive side of things works, it's easier to be less competitive. And that's a thing you can take away from a lot of the videos I do as well, is that, it's once you know how things work, and if you know a unit, for example, is very, very, very good, that that's a unit you should maybe take less of, as an example. Now, talking to your opponent is always going to be the ultimately best way to get a good game where you're both on the same level. That's never going to not be the case. But the things we're going to talk about are things that you can do away from the table. So maybe when you're not talking to your opponent, for example, when you're going to an event, when you don't know who your opponents are going to be, or maybe just, when you don't know the person you're going to be having a game against. But people do play 30k competitively. It's important to recognise that fact, and lots of people do it without realising it. People always like, again, looking at good units with good stats. They want to put them on the table, and sometimes you can take that a little bit too far, maybe without realising it. And some people do it because they want to play competitively as well, which, as we've said, is also okay. And then, there's another third class of people who do just enough competitive stuff in their army to make sure they're winning games without it being super obvious that they're making a competitive army. The first two are both okay. One of them is playing for fun. One of them is playing competitively. The third one is playing for fun whilst actually playing competitively, and that one's not really cool. So, this is not aimed at those people. This is aimed at people who are trying to self-police their game down. It's important to recognise that. And it's also important to say, don't be bullet point number 3. Don't be the person taking competitive armies to a fun event and pretending like your army is something that it's not. Ultimately, if, like me, you're trying to toe the line between a powerful army, a fun army for you and your opponent, and an army that fits in your narrative and cool units that you want to play, this video is for you. So what makes a competitive army? Well, there's a lot of things that go into a competitive army, but generally you can summarise broadly into these 4 points, I think. The first thing is skew. So skew is generally regarded as taking lots of units of the same type, not necessarily the same unit, but the same type of unit to overwhelm your opponent in some regard, in some area of the game. Usually that would be taking lots of units that have all got the same defensive stats. So, for example, taking a whole army where everything's got a 2+ save basically invalidates most of your opponent's guns, that don't penetrate that. And on the flip side, taking a whole army of nothing but Space Marines and no vehicles or anything else at all invalidates all your opponent's big guns. So those are both two examples of two types of skew. The other is spam. So spam is one most people will know. It's just generally taking multiple of the same thing because they're powerful. A good example currently in Heresy is Dreadnoughts. You see lots of people taking lots and lots of Dreadnoughts, and you've even got the potential to use Fury of the Ancients, which gives you all Dreadnoughts. Spam is just taking lots of the same thing because it's powerful. Efficiency sort of plays into the spam a little bit. This is just taking units that are good for their points. So even if you don't spam or you don't skew, you can still have an army that's very efficient just by only using units that are really good for what you pay for them as well. And finally, something I would call focus. This is really about executing a very specific game plan designed to optimize your army's potential. And most armies, when people put them together, will have some level of this. But from a competitive standpoint, you might have an army that is, all guns, and your game plan is just to shoot the opponent off the table, or, all melee like a drop assault, where your game plan is just to drop and kill everyone in melee. Where you've got this pre-decided game plan, you've got a very focused list, and that tends to make it more competitive. So those four are not the only things that make a competitive army, but they're generally the parts that are regarded as a bit more negative and are the parts that feel a bit more negative to play against most of the time. The positive parts of a competitive army, though, are actually the bits that we want to keep, as they're the bits that make the game interesting. So other things that make armies competitive in Warhammer tend to be things like maneuverability or synergies or having the right tactical options in your army, making sure you've got ways to cover what your opponent's doing. Those are all important things in competitive armies as well, but those are actually the bits we like. And if you can do those bits without the skew and the spam and everything else, then you're in a good place generally for having a fun army that's also good to play. Now, it is worth mentioning as well, you can be too competitive, in inverted commas, but too competitive with only doing a little bit of this, especially if your armies are built for fun. So because of the type of armies people will often bring to Heresy games, you don't have to be running a full competitive spam army to be being a bit too competitive for another person, because some people will turn up with armies that are just purely for fun. And if you've even gone a little bit in the competitive direction, you can find that your army just overwhelms someone, and that might be what you're into, but the point of this video really is to try not to overwhelm people to the point where there's no game. I certainly don't enjoy playing games with people where I know I'm going to win before I put my army on the table, because my army is being built to be a bit more serious than somebody else's. Okay, so first let's talk about how not to skew. So the main way not to skew is not to invalidate entire classes of weapons. So as I mentioned before, if you take an entire army that is nothing but Terminators, Dreadnoughts, AV-15 vehicles, maybe to some extent as well, you've basically made most of the weapons that aren't, super high AP pointless. And against a lot of people, a lot of the weapons they've put on the table will be kind of pointless, and that gives you a very big advantage. It doesn't mean they're not going to still hurt stuff. 60 bolter shots and Terminators will still do something, but you've basically skewed to one direction. The way to avoid this is to make sure you're mixing up your unit types, which is giving your opponent a variety of different things to deal with. So vehicles, if you're going to take flyers, don't take lots of them. Some infantry, some dreadnoughts. If you're mixing up the things that are in your army and they've got different profiles, some armor 3, some armor 2+ is fine. Some things that have got high toughness, low toughness, you're basically doing the opposite of skew, which generally makes for a good game because your opponent's always got something to do in their turn. At that point, they've always got something to shoot at. You're giving your opponent a good game by mixing those things up. Now, some Right to War do push you towards skew, and that's just part of the way Heresy's written. And obviously that's, okay if you want to use those Right to War, and, you shouldn't have to avoid them to avoid the skew. But you can try to minimize it. As an example, you can run Fury of the Ancients without running nothing but Dreadnoughts. You can run a Warlord Dreadnought, and you can run a couple of, line compulsory Dreadnoughts, but you can still put other things in the army, even though you're limited. You could still bring other things in your other slots. You can bring some tactical squads. You can bring some vehicles and that kind of stuff. You can unskew even something that's as powerful as a Fury of the Ancients list. And that's the opportunities you need to look for to minimise this, to make sure you both get a good game. How not to spam? Well, this is probably a bit of an obvious one. Just take lots of things, not just lots of the best thing, but how you do this while still keeping your army viable and your army doing what you want to do is the secret, right? Because you don't want to end up with an army you don't enjoy playing either. So a way to do this is to try to achieve the same army goals, but by achieving them with a variety of different units rather than multiples of the same unit. So as an example, if you are going to want to shoot people with heavy weapons, maybe instead of taking 3 heavy weapon squads, which is super good units, you could take a heavy weapon squad, you could take a rapier, you could take a land speeder with some multi-melters. You can get all the heavy weapons in there that you want, but you can get them by using a variety of different individual units, which will make your army a bit worse, which is kind of the point, but will also make it more interesting for both you and your opponent to play, hopefully, as well. Now, again, some Right to War do push you towards spam, and again, that's okay, as long as you're not spamming units that are too powerful. So, for example, the Armoured Assault list with lots of Predators in, that's okay, because Predators aren't super silly. They can be killed, they're only armor 13, most lists can deal with them, particularly if you include a few squads in Rhinos in the list as well. You mix it up a little bit so you're not spamming. The Right to War are fine, they work fine, you've just got to play them in such a way as they're not spammy. Unit variety generally just looks great on the tabletop and plays more fun. And this is the direction I'm going in with my own army. Now, I'm trying to diversify it a little bit more to use a few different types of units on the tabletop. My rule of thumb is try not to run more than 2 of any one unit type, especially if those units are powerful. So I'm playing Iron Hands with Dreadnoughts. I've got 3 in 2,000 points, which is probably pushing it a little bit for maybe being a little bit too good. But, I've got 2 Contemptors and 1 Leviathan. Maybe that could be a bit less. I don't really know. But, as an idea, I would consider going to 3 Contemptors, a little bit in the direction of spam. And you can apply that to most units. If you've only got 2 of something, no one can say that you're spamming. So that's a bit of a rule of thumb for you to think about. Now let's talk about how to be less efficient. So as I mentioned before, some games you can win on efficiency alone with no skewing or spamming. And this is what you see a lot when people are running armies that are maybe a little bit too competitive, either accidentally or to be sort of hiding the competitiveness of the army. If all you take in your army is just great units, even if you don't spam or skew at all, you will still have a very powerful army. And what you'll find is you will beat a lot of people on your army alone, just because no matter what you do on the tabletop, their armies can't keep up. So you need to make sure you're not doing this accidentally or on purpose. So you can lower your efficiency. So you can still take good units, but you can give them suboptimal weapon choices, potentially. So maybe instead of putting those, 2 las cannon arms on your Dreadnought, you could give it 1 multi-melter arm and 1 las cannon arm potentially, or you could give it a fist and a conversion beamer instead of a fist and a las cannon. Las cannons are obviously one of the optimal weapon choices on a Dreadnought. Use some of the suboptimal ones, but still use your Dreadnought. Alternatively, the other way around, you can replace efficient units in your army with things that do the same job less efficiently. As an example of this, the Scorpius is a really good artillery piece. It's really great at killing Marines. It gets Rend and 4. It's pinning. It's strength 8, so it instant death things. And it's only 120 points. It's the very obviously best artillery piece in the book. And if you want to try to be less efficient in your army overall, you can replace that with something like a Morbus Bombard, which is, 80 odd points more expensive and just worse at doing the same thing. But it will still fill the role that you're looking for in the army, which is shooting stuff with artillery. That's one way of doing it. And you don't have to make everything in your army less efficient. If you think your army is maybe just a bit too efficient, which is the problem I'm having with my Iron Hands right now, I'm just making 25% of the units in the army less good, and I'll see if that makes my army less efficient enough to not be too good on the tabletop, and you can just tweak it as you go on. This also gives you an opportunity to use some interesting or weaker units and find ways to make them play the role that you need them to play, or a role in your army that didn't exist before. So I'm using a land speeder in my Iron Hands as an example, and that land speeder could be a javelin, because javelins are just better land speeders in almost all regards, especially in Iron Hands. But I'm using 1 javelin and 1 land speeder, which means that I've still got the same thing. I've still got a couple of things zipping around the board, which makes the game more interesting for me. but means I'm not just using 2 of the same super efficient units, and I'm also, spamming less as well. You can always find ways to make less good units fill roles that you need them to play. Another example might be you use Invictus Suzerains in Ultramarines because they are one of the most cost-efficient units in the game, and they're frankly bonkers stats-wise. You could use a unit of Veterans, which are basically just worse in every way, but you can tool them up and kit them out a little bit differently and maybe personalise the unit a little bit and just find ways to make that veteran unit play the role that you intended for the Suzerains and just do it a little bit worse and be a bit less efficient and get an opportunity to do some modelling in there at the same time. And finally, how not to focus. This is sort of like how not to have a game plan that is too good for the game in a lot of ways. So a lot of the time when you're building a competitive army, you try to solve the puzzle with units before the game starts. So you might try to put an assault army together or a shooting army or an army where you're going to try and tie your whole enemy's army up in combat turn 1 so you can take all the objectives or whatever your game plan is. That tends to lead you to building a very efficient army and looking for ways to make that plan work. And a really good way to avoid that is to try to not do that. Try not to have a pre-planned game plan. Try just to take, what a lot of people would say, units that you like. And you can take lots of good units. You can take a variety of lots of good units that will be able to deal with whatever situation's on the table. But if you haven't focused and optimized for a very specific plan, your army is likely to be less competitive and a little bit more varied. Pure gun lines can be boring to play against and to play as well. And I say this as someone who's built one accidentally. I put a bunch of dreadnoughts with all my shooty iron hands thinking it would give me something to move around the table. And it was actually quite boring to play my army in the games I've played so far, and probably a bit boring to play against as well. So I'm looking to change that up. Also, pure assault armies are generally viewed as less boring, but in actual fact, when they're done properly and competitively, can still create bland games, because what you'll find with melee armies is they want to alpha strike or they just want to get into combat as soon as possible, because you have to with a melee army. So people will take lots of jump packs, lots of protected deep strike or whatever it is to just get their whole army into combat straight away. And effectively the game becomes, if they get into combat, you would assume they're going to win. If they don't get into combat, they're going to lose. And that can be quite a bland game as well. If everybody's mixing it up, it means there's just more going on and less binary situations like that. And finally, I would say, and I think most people generally agree, combined arms generally looks good and feels cool to play with on the table. When you've got a mix of Space Marines and tanks and dreadnoughts and planes and whatever else you've got, your army looks like something out of a story rather than something that's been over-optimized, and generally that works well for both players. And then some specific things to avoid on top of those general things as well. So one is Death Stars. I would say, don't build Death Stars. Generally, Death Stars are very tough to kill units that are also super good at killing whatever they touch. So this will often be like a Primarch with a retinue and a Primus Medicae and that kind of stuff. The game just becomes all about that unit. It might be 1,000 points plus a Spartan, it might be half your army or more, and the game basically becomes, can the opponent kill that before it kills all of their stuff, which is not that fun. It's not that fun to play against Death Stars. If you're not playing a competitive game, it's not really the kind of thing you want to be playing. And personally, I also find it not that much fun to play either. Also, unkillable units in general, and nothing's actually unkillable, but if you think about Phalanx Warders in Stone Gauntlet, against a lot of enemies, people will just find them so difficult to remove, and it's not super fun to play against. So it's not like you can't run any of those units at all, particularly if you like those units, but try to not run them in configurations that makes them too hard to kill. Maybe leave out the Apothecary if they're already tough, or don't put an Apothecary in every unit or something like that. Primarchs and low point games, this is something I see really commonly. I see people taking Primarchs at 2k, and I've took a bit of a temperature check for this from some people who play Heresy and have played it for a long time. And most people I've spoken to agree that taking Primarchs in low point games, like 2,000 points or less, is a bit much. Primarchs generally are pretty good for their points. For 400 or so points, most of them, they're very, very powerful. And they're like mini Death Stars in a lot of ways. So I would also avoid doing that unless you and your opponent are maybe agreeing to both do it. Alpha Strikes, generally, Alpha Strikes is a very competitive thing to do. The idea that you're going to go first and take a bunch of your opponent's units off the table before they get a chance to do anything is just the way Warhammer works. But if you're building your army to do that in particular, whether it's through guns or assaults, you're playing competitively. And everyone who's been on the receiving end of an Alpha Strike knows that having a bunch of your stuff taken off the table when there's very little you can do about it isn't fun at all. So that's a thing to avoid. And likely sacrificial units as well. So sacrificial units generally are things like, a bunch of men with good guns like Melter Guns in a Rhino or Dark Angels, Inter-Emperors and that kind of stuff. The aim of these is generally to drive forward, jump out of their Rhino, shoot something that's worth more points they are, and then they'll often die in return. Kind of like an Alpha Strike, but, a very specific kind. That's also a very competitive thing to do. If you've got a unit that's solely designed to jump out of a vehicle, kill more than its own points and it dies, that's competitive. So avoiding that, or at least avoiding doing too much of that, is a good way to keep your army more balanced. And then, obviously, overpowered rules and interactions. There are some. Sometimes you and your opponent can agree on how a rule is intended to work and fix some problems, but some rules are very clear how they're meant to work. For example, Fafnir ran in a unit of Phalanx Warders as a 3+ rerollable invulnerable save, which is just bonkers in the context of the way Horus Heresy works. And if you know that that's a thing that can happen, you just don't do it. Just avoid doing those things. Yes, it's completely legal, everything else, but it's overpowered by accident. This is the way Games Workshop write rules, and you can self-police to avoid doing those things. So in summary, assess your army and what it's good at, and be honest with yourself. If it's a bit too good in any area, whether that's spam, skew, focusing too much on a game plan, maybe too efficient, just take it down a notch. You obviously don't want to play an army that isn't good. We all want to play, and most people not playing super competitively, but will still be building their armies to try to win games. You don't need to make your army bad, but just try and take it down a notch, thinking about the variety of different skill levels and players you might play against, and find a level where even if your army is better than some other people's maybe, it's not so much better that there's no game. And most of all, use this as an opportunity for adding interesting or different units to your list. If you're not a narrative-first player where you're just taking units for things that you like, which, I assume you're probably not if you're watching this video, at least this is a good thing. It's a good opportunity to do this. And all those units you would like to use, like I really want a unit of Iron Hands veterans with maces, even though that unit is diabolical on the tabletop and completely pointless in the context of the way my army works. Spending 150 points on that will tone down the overall power level of my army and gives me a chance to use this unit that I've got a vision for in my head of how I want it to look. So, take the positives as a person trying to play the game. First and foremost, take the positives out of trying to tune your army down by using it as an opportunity for those cool things. And that's the end of the show. Hope you enjoyed the discussion. It was certainly an unusual discussion to have. Please do leave me a like or subscribe on YouTube if that was the case and you did enjoy it. And if there's anything in the show that you've got any comments on or any feedback that you've got on the video at all, please leave it in the comments on YouTube below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.